And let's get going with this lesson. Okay, so today we are talking about transport in plants. All right, so in like those old growth forests that I was talking about like 30 seconds ago, the water has a really far distance to travel between the roots and the leaves. Okay, so today we're going to talk about how that water is actually transported throughout the plant. Okay, we're also going to talk about how like sucrose is transported. I'm just looking at my cat right now. He's on the counter. Hey, get off, beat it. Sorry about that. So we're going to also talk about how sucrose, one of the products of photosynthesis, is transported through the plant as well. All right. So we know from previous lessons that water is transported throughout the plants in the xylem tissue. This is really important because water is required for photosynthesis. And again, this occurs in palisade tissue cells. Remember those terms. So palisade tissue cells and photosynthesis both start with P's. That's just an easy way for me to remember where photosynthesis occurs. We've talked about transpiration a little bit throughout this week. So this process occurs when water exits the leaf through the stomata. Okay, those are guarded and regulated by guard cells. And the interactions, so cohesion and adhesion of water molecules, these might be new terms to you guys, but we're going to talk about them in a little bit. The properties of water and the structure of like the xylem and the phloem is going to help transport water against the force of gravity. Okay. So for these trees that are huge, I mean, like look at the size of these children hugging this tree, right? They can, you could probably have like an entire class around the base of that tree, right? So this tree is going to consume a lot of water, and moving water, we're moving at force across a distance. So we have to put work into that. Okay. So we have to tie that into our physics unit. Okay. So cohesion and adhesion. So these are two interactions that describe the attractions of water to either other water molecules, so that's cohesion, or to just other things in general. Okay, so if we look at this diagram on the bottom right-hand corner of our screen, we see cohesion is the attraction of two water molecules. So these are two little happy water molecules. So that's cohesion. This is what is responsible for the surface tension of water. Okay, we talked about this a little bit in class. So if you jump off a diving board and you do a belly flop, right, because you're not like slowly breaking the surface tension of water, then it's going to hurt us when we kind of break that surface tension of water with our body, right? Divers will try to minimize their surface area as they enter the water. So if you ever watch Olympic diving, they're amazing. I think that's one of the coolest things to watch is Olympic diving. But as they go in to the water, they minimize their surface area. So there's not as much surface tension acting on them. And then they enter pretty smoothly and there is barely a splash. Okay, so cohesion. So this is the attraction between two water molecules. So cohesion is usually something interacting with itself. Conversely, we have adhesion. So this is the attraction of water molecules to other substances. So in this bottom right diagram here, we see a water molecule kind of hanging out and making friends with a paper fiber. Okay, so if you have a spill on the table, you can clean it up with a paper towel. And if you actually just kind of like dip the paper towel so it's barely touching the water or the spill, the adhesive forces between the water molecules and the paper towel will actually cause the water to move up the paper towel. Okay, so if you guys are bored, I would encourage you to try this at home. Okay. Cohesion, again, if we take like a eyedropper or just like a droplet, something that'll drop water drop by drop, okay? If you do it really slowly and carefully and you make like a bubble of water on your table, you'll see that it kind of like is round at the edge of it, okay? The cohesive forces between the water molecules is what's responsible for holding into that kind of like circular bubble shape. Okay, so again, big takeaway here, cohesion is the attraction of water molecules to other water molecules, and adhesion is the attraction of water to molecules of other substances. Okay, so make sure you know the difference between cohesion and adhesion. Okay, actually, so we talked about capillary action, or I talked about capillary action in some of your assignments. Okay, so capillary action is what, so this is the top right diagram up here. This is an example of capillary action. So because the diameter of the tube, a capillary tube is what it's called, because the diameter is so small that water is actually going to want to move up that capillary tube. The adhesive forces between the water and the glass, in this case, will allow it to actually rise above the water level in there. Okay, so that's what I mean by capillary action, when you have something that is so small that it actually naturally draws water up. Okay, so the xylem, which is responsible for water transport in plants, the structure of the xylem is many really long and thin tubes. Okay, and this is to actually encourage capillary action. So water starts to move from the roots of the plant up to the leaves of the plant. Okay, so capillary action helps water move up the from the roots to the tree, or to the leaves rather. Okay, so make sure you know that capillary action is partially responsible, or it helps move water from the roots to the leaves. Okay, another thing that is going to help move water from the roots to the leaves is something that we call root pressure. Okay, so pressure in the xylem of plant cells. So the definition of root pressure is, this is pressure in the xylem of plant cells from the movement of water due to a concentration gradient. Okay, anytime we have the movement of water across a membrane, we consider that osmosis. Okay, dissolved minerals are present in the root cells through active transport. So in the soil, there are in comparison to inside of the plant, there are going to be less minerals and nutrients within the soil. Okay, there are minerals and nutrients in the soil, but it's going to be a lower concentration than is what actually is found in the leaf. Okay, so if there's a higher concentration in the plant or in the roots than there is in the soil, to continue to move those nutrients and those ions into the plant, we need to spend energy to do that. So that's why dissolved minerals are transported into the roots through active transport. So this will create a higher solute concentration within the cell. Okay, and then when we get that, and if we have higher solute concentration inside the cell, that is going to help water move into the cell because it wants to reduce that concentration gradient in there. So water enters the cells through osmosis. So once there's a higher solute of concentration in the roots, water is going to move into the soil from the roots, and that is going to start the movement of water up the plants. Okay, so it starts from the bottom. Okay. So roots are very important for that. So active transport is what occurs, or this is what powers the ability for the plant to acquire more solute concentration than is what is in the soil surrounding the plant. Okay, so we're gonna talk about a few steps here. So step one, we're at the bottom of this diagram here. We have a higher solute concentration in the cell. So, and that is done by active transport. So then water is going to flow into the cell to try to minimize that concentration gradient. Okay, so we're down here. Water is flowing into the plant. Okay, now once the water enters the root cells, this is going to create root pressure. And then at the top of the leaves, this is where transpiration is occurring, right? We've talked about this before. So the net movement of water, it's leaving the leaves. Okay, I gotta let my cat outside. All right, sorry about that. So transpiration occurs in the leaves, right? So so water is exiting through the leaves, and is what's happening between the leaves and the roots is those cohesive and adhesive forces of the water molecules. So the cohesive forces between the water molecules, and then also the adhesive forces between the water molecules and the sides of the xylem. Okay, so those interactions are going to kind of help it up, just like when we talked about capillary action there. Now that we're on the topic of cohesion, so one thing that might help you kind of think of cohesion a little bit differently. So when you ever drink a beverage from a straw, so is what's happening. So of course you are applying a force with your mouth to start drawing that beverage up the straw. But is what's happening actually at the base of the straw? It's the cohesive forces between the water molecules in there. When they're attaching to each other, like, you're coming with me, we're going up the straw, right? So cohesion is occurring at like the base of the straw. So it's like all the water molecules want to hang out and not get drinking by themselves. So they're like, hey, you're coming with me, friends. So that what helps the movement of liquid up straws. Okay. And this is also the same idea that is behind siphoning gasoline or just siphoning any fluid in general. Okay. So for gasoline, if you're siphoning it from one car to another or whatever, you'll put the tube in to the one gas tank. You'll suck on the tube, so you get the movement of gasoline coming up the tube, and then the cohesive forces within the gasoline is what continues that stream of gasoline from the one tank to another. All right, so this is how water is transported throughout the cells. So make sure you put a big star on this slide here, okay? I'm going to ask you guys to tell me a story about how water is transported from the roots to the leaves, and all of the like tissues and cells and functions and concepts that we've talked about in this unit, how all of those kind of like tie in to one another. Okay, so that's a big one. Tonicity of plant cells. So we have talked about this before. So remember, hypotonic is when there is a higher solute concentration inside the cell. So water will enter the cell and swell due to turgor pressure. So here's an image of hypotonic here. We have higher solute concentration in here. So the net movement of water is going to be inside of the cell. Isotonic, this is where there is equal solute concentration inside and outside of the cell. So there's not really going to be a net movement of water. And then lastly, we have hypertonic. This is where there's a higher solute concentration outside of the cell, and the water will leave the cell and shrink. This is considered plasmolysis. Okay, and this is when we kind of see like wilting leaves because there's the plants are just kind of like dehydrated in a sense. Now that we're talking about these types of tonicity, this kind of ties into why you should never drink seawater if you're stranded at sea. Okay, so if you were to drink salt water, is what's going to happen once it goes into your stomach and it's transported across your like stomach membranes into your bloodstream, then you will have a hypertonic solution of blood, right? You're going to have more salt in your blood than you would in your cells. So what's going to happen, all the water in your cells is going to leave through osmosis to try to regulate that concentration gradient. And that will actually make you more dehydrated than you would have been before you drank the seawater. Okay, so if you're ever stuck at sea on a kayak or on a boat, do not drink the seawater. You can work on like desalination practices, which you could actually do, but we won't get into that today. Okay, so we just talked about transporting water. Now we're going to be talking about transporting sugars. So sugar is just kind of like a general term for any carbohydrate. So in fruits, we get fructose, which is a type of sugar. Sucrose is a product of photosynthesis. Okay, so there's just there's a family of sugars. Sugar is just kind of like a broader category of that. Okay, so sucrose and other sugars are transported through the phloem tissue. Remember, food flows. Okay, the leaf, which is the primary site of photosynthesis. There are still photosynthesis that will occur in the stem of a plant. It's just kind of any part of a plant that is green. This is a site of photosynthesis because chloroplasts are what give the plants the green color. Okay, so the leaf is going to be the source of sucrose because it is making the majority of the sucrose in the plant. Okay, so once it is created, we have a high concentration of sugar up here. Okay, so we need to get that into the phloem. Okay, once it's into the phloem, it's going to move from a high concentration, which is up in the leaf, to an area of low concentration down here. So into the root system and the stems or other plant cells. Okay, so we have a high concentration of sugar up here. Once it's transported into the phloem, it's going to want to minimize that concentration gradient. So we'll go from an area of high concentration up here to an area of low concentration down here. And as what's happening, remember the water is going to move by osmosis to try to eliminate that concentration gradient. So that movement of water, trying to eliminate that concentration gradient that is found in the phloem, that is going to help distribute the sugars throughout the phloem. Okay. When we are down here, we will have the sugars will enter the root by active or passive transport. So if we have high concentration here and a low concentration here, it will move in by passive transport. Okay, remember active transport is we're moving it against a concentration gradient. Okay, so two terms we have to just talk about here. So we have the source. So this is going to be like the source of the energy. And then we're talking about the sink. So this is what is actually consuming the sugar that is produced from the source. So what that means is that the source, so the sugar where it is produced, so the source of the production, and the sink, where does that production go to? All right, this is another very important slide. So make sure you're able to describe the processes that are involved with moving the water up the plant and also moving the sugars from the source to the sink of the plant. Okay. Cool. So we're almost done. So we just talked about the transport of sugars. We talked about the transport of water. Okay, now we're going to talk about the actual movement of the plant. Okay, so phototropism is the growth movement of leaves in a plant in response to light. So if you guys have any house plants or anything like that, you may notice that every once in a while you have to rotate it because it's growing more towards the sun or to the light, right? So this little experiment we have at the bottom of your screen here. So let's start right here. Okay, so remember the rapidly growing region of a plant where the specialized growth occurs is called the apical meristem. So is what these guys had done here in this particular instance. I'm just gonna put some letters here. So let's do this as A. Okay, so in scenario A, they covered the apical meristem with something that would not, so it's opaque. It does not let any of the light to go through. And is what occurred in that scenario is that the plant just grew straight up. It did not respond to light at all. Okay. Then is what happened once they removed the cap. Okay. It was still going to be growing upwards, right? But in our control experiment, so in our section C here, they just let it grow as normal. They didn't put a cap or anything like that. And they noticed that the plant would grow towards the light source. So in this case, the sun. Okay. So that is evidence that phototropism does occur. And in particular, the apical meristem is important for that because here we still had growth, but here we had growth in direction of the sunlight. Okay, if we look on the right side of this image here, they were just trying to find out which part is actually responsible for like the phototropism. So is what they did on this side here. So the base, I'm just trying to find my mouse, there it is. So the base right here, so let's call this one B. Sorry that I have not been doing these in order. But in this case here, they covered the base with the opaque shield, and is what they realized after they let it grow for a few days that the plant would still grow in the direction of the sunlight. Okay, so from experiment B, they found that the phototropism was influenced by, well, between B and D. So I'm going to write D now as soon as I find my cursor. There it is. So this is going to be D. So between C and D, so experiment D, they covered the tip with a transparent cap, and transparent will, the term transparent will allow the majority of the light to go through it. So when they covered the tip with a transparent cap, they still noticed that that plant would grow towards the sunlight. So from all of these different types of control experiments and manipulated experiment or manipulated variables, they were able to find that the phototropic part in plants is at the apical meristem. Okay, you do not need to know this whole experiment, what I just talked about, but know what phototropism is. Okay, the growth of movement of leaves or the plant in response to light. Okay. So the leaves and the stem are not the only thing that is influenced by a tropism, is what we're going to call. Um, so stem and the leaves, they have a stimulus to light, and we call this a positive phototropism. So when it is stimulated by the light, the plant and the stem will start to grow in the direction of that light. Okay, the next plant part is the root. If that is stimulated by light, we don't really notice a phototropism within the roots. Okay, so the roots do not want to grow towards the sun. That makes sense because if, remember we talked about the roots not having a cuticle. If the roots were out and exposed to sunlight, they would have a really rapid rate of evaporation. And we want our roots to go into the ground, right? So is what roots actually experience. So when there's a stimulus of gravity, roots have a tendency to grow downwards. Okay. Of course, the shoot system is above the ground and the root system is below the ground. And the root system is involved with nutrient absorption and water absorption from the ground, as well as stability. So that should make sense that we want our roots to grow in the downward direction, right? Now, the next plant part is the stem. So if it's stimulus to gravity, it doesn't really have one, okay? Because remember, the stem wants to grow up and towards the sun, okay? So big takeaways from this one is that the root experiences positive gravitropism, so meaning that it grows downwards, and that the stem experiences positive phototropism, so the stem wants to grow towards the sun or the light source. Okay, so that is it for the biology lesson. I'm just going to stop recording here.